The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson. Good luck with today's lesson.
Okay, so we're ready to do speeches. And again, 45 seconds long.
Number 30, exodusters. Exodusters were African Americans that left the South and moved to Kansas. That's D. 31, John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil. D. 32, the Blank Act sought to divide tribal lands among Indian peoples in order to gain more land for American pioneers. The Dawes Act. B. 33, the Sioux and other Indian nations were finally defeated because the U.S. military was a standing army. It's a war of attrition. D. 34, what was the name of the last major incident between the United States military and American Indians? It's Wounded Knee Massacre. C. 35, what happened at Promontory Point, Utah in 1869, the joining of the Transcontinental Railroad. C. 36, what occurred at Little Bighorn, Montana in June of 1876. Custer and the Southern Cavalry were defeated. Actually, all killed, so that's B. 37, what was the Haymarket riot? Bomb thrown into a crowd of police and strikers in Chicago. B. And 38, concerns over the economic powers of large corporations led Congress to pass the Sherman Antitrust Act, which proved to be weak. That's B. For short answers, President Johnson ordered to rescind Field Order 15 hurt freedmen because it took away the 40 acres of land that was being distributed to freemen of those hundreds of thousands of acres that had been abandoned. So that meant that they had no choice but to end up working on the former plantations. What is peonage? It's perpetual debt. So it can be the form of debt that you can't get out of. 41, what was the very popular circus-like Western show called in the late 19th century? Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show. 42, what are some of the reasons that brought about the destruction of the traditional way of life for Native Americans in the American West? So obviously taking away their land, the destruction of the buffalo herds, the forced assimilation of the children where they had to go to boarding schools. So those are the main answers. Settlement of white settlers. 43, name two of the many reasons that allowed American corporations to prosper in the 19th century. So child labor, low wages because of large numbers of unskilled workers. So from both Europe and from American farms that moving in, they could prosper because of the railroad and canals, transportation networks meant that transportation was cheaper. The availability of rich natural resources across the continent that could be accessed. So those are all reasons. Laissez-faire government with no regulations. 44, the 10% plan just simply said something.
Yes.
Yeah, we're talking about 43.
43. Was it railroad? 2?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Railroads? Yeah, market run.
No, you told me, remember
I told you you were going to be mad.
Yeah.
Because I am.
And as soon as I walked out of the class,
I
I told her that I said the question, and I was like, it's probably railroads and probably like some stupid
Oil
oil
or
companies.
Was oil one?
Well, it's a natural resource, so technically.
All right.
Okay.
Now I
I
know.
told you. 10% plan, just simply Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction, but if you chose Tony Lower, that would be great. Sometimes people overthought it or told me things, misremembered it, and then you just ended up writing all the wrong stuff. So, explain the idea of social Darwinism. It's a corruption of Darwin's theory of evolution that applied to society, where the idea was that and some people did write it, but remember the WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, thought they were on top, and then other races below them. So depending on how you said it, could have gotten anywhere from half a point to 2 points. 46. Name 2 ways that people were disenfranchised in the South. So the literacy test and the poll tax are the most common. Grandfather clause. If you said anything about just intimidation and use of Ku Klux Klan or whatever, that's totally fine too, because that's perfectly legitimate.
Jim
Well, yeah, but that's definitely.
Jim Crow had disenfranchisement in the definition.
What I was asking for was being more specific.
But the Jim Crow is what happened, right?
Well, Jim Crow is a whole system of segregation, and not necessarily the.
But it was the segregation, which was it definitely disenfranchised the African Americans.
Well, let me think about it. Let's see. Maybe I'll give you a half a point if I didn't.
No, I got him. I'm just.
Did I give it to you?
Yeah.
I did. So what's wrong?
No, I didn't. I put 2 other ones, but I just thought of the other one and I wanted to know
Okay.
if it was right or wrong based on my thinking.
that's. Yeah. See, what I'm asking for was very specific. Where am I? Okay. 47. How did Andrew Carnegie help people have greater access to books? He built thousands of libraries across North America, as well as Europe. 48, the labor union represented unskilled workers and had a membership of 730,000 by 1886, the Knights of Labor. 49, what is vertical integration? Owning most or all of the parts of production and raw materials, transportation. So 50. How did railroads help the United States prosper in the 19th century? They provided quick and cheap form of transportation of people and goods, and access to natural resources that were too remote. So anything there, that's good. What was the Comstock lode? Largest silver deposit discovered in the United States, and $400 million worth of silver. What was peonage? No, that was there again, but that's why I gave you actually, if you got it, fine, but that's why I gave you that extra question that I wrote on the board. So, which, by the way, was either Calumet Hecla or the Quincy Mine. The dance that was performed by Native Americans to rid
So the Cliff Mines
white
wasn't
settlers
one?
is the ghost dance. Pardon me?
So the Cliff Mines wasn't one
The
of
Cliff
them?
Mine. I
I
think
thought
the way
that
I
was the
worded it
first one.
was
Yeah.
the 2 important. I forget how I worded it, but
One of the 2
if you wrote the,
separate
I was
mines.
asking for the way I worded it was for those 2 mines. The
Yeah.
Cliff Mine was was one of the very first that was successful, but it was not a major company for very long. Why did the South secede from the Union? Slavery. Sometimes people wrote these long answers. Slavery. Who were robber barons? They were wealthy business owners who made their fortunes by generally exploiting their workers. All right. Anyway, overall, like I said, nice job. If I can have the tests themselves, keep the Scantrons, that's fine. And if you didn't do so well, remember that the final is designed to allow you to have one more test, and if you do well in the final, then I'll throw away your full test grade. Okay?
I can't do an Adam White and change. That's worse. Yes.
My computer's doing something that's never done before. It's doing that, going to sleep like that. It's totally never done that in whatever the 7 years or 6 years that I've had it. He's doing that when I opened it up this morning, which was weird. Closed. Yeah.
Did you start on it? I think it'll start next week.
Try it.
So I'm going to go through chapter 17. This is one of my favorite units of the semester. What I unfortunately won't have time to get to today, so I didn't have time to get to it yesterday either, is like specifics on the World's Fairs or the Gilded Age and how the 1% lived, which I'll be talking about on Thursday and probably next Tuesday. But they're some of my favorite topics. I mean, the Gilded Age is a fascinating period, even though you have a small portion of the population, only 1 to 2%, that controls something like over 90% of the wealth in this country, and everybody else is left to kind of try to eke it out. Okay. This building costs millions of dollars. They can't get a decent screen.
Starts flying out.
Okay. So hopefully you're seeing a pattern of the way that the course is laid out, and hopefully you've been reading your book. And obviously, it was quite clear that people have been studying just as well as showing them. But we're continuing on with this kind of journey of American history in the late 19th century and what's occurring in society and politically as well as socially. And so you already know or have been introduced to many of these ideas. It's just as we go along, they get more and more in depth with certain ideas that come up before. So 19th century, after the Civil War, the population numbers are rising greatly, you know that. Large numbers of immigration are coming in. Immigrants are coming in from Southern and Eastern Europe, but also many people are moving from the farms to the cities, large farm families. don't necessarily have all the kids going into farming. And so there often young men are moving to the cities. And so the cities are crowded. Now, I should point out that throughout the 19th century, there's still more people that live on the farm and in the rural countryside than actually live in cities. But the census won't show more people living in cities until the 1920 census. So that period somewhere between 1910 and 1920, the demographics completely changes. But nevertheless, the cities are becoming more and more important. Obviously, the industries that are building up there are the reason why people are moving to the cities to find new opportunities. But as you've heard me talk about in the past, they have these problems. So high rates of disease and death are common, of course, historically in the days before any type of modern medicine. And so this is true both in the countryside as well as in the cities. Certainly, disease can be spread much quicker in the cities because of close proximity with everybody living so close to each other, and because of the horrible infrastructure that still exists at the time. A lack of proper sanitation. They are putting in sewer systems in the late 19th century in most cities, but nevertheless, where are the sewers draining to? Often into the water, bodies of water where people's water supply is coming from. So that's no good. A poor sewer system, contaminated drinking water. And historically, of course, drinking water is contaminated, and people are very hesitant about actually drinking water. But nevertheless, you need water to survive. So, people drank things like ales because, it's processed in the beer and it's boiled and then fermented, and then fermented drinks because that kills bacteria. But anyway, that's what leads to a whole another problem with people drinking too much, which is something that people are talking about at this time period as well. So, in the cities, of course, you have all these work animals. Unless you're fairly prosperous, you probably don't have a horse and carriage, because horses require a lot of care and maintenance. You have to have a place to house them. And so it doesn't mean that there aren't people that have their own private carriages. The middle class, certainly if they can afford it and have a big plot of land, can build a carriage barn and house their horse. Or there were like public carriage barns where you could board your horse and have other people take care of it, and then you would go get it or send for it when you needed to hook it up to your carriage, things like that. But anyway, lots of work animals. I use this photograph here because it's taken, I believe, in the south side of Chicago. And here's these kids literally playing in the gutter, and there's a dead horse next to them. And that apparently was a common sight in the 19th century. If your horse died, you just were like, oh well, I'll let someone else deal with it, and you just like left it there. And obviously that's not good. If you ever had like an animal die in your yard, I had like a groundhog or something die underneath my window one time, and I was like, what is that smell? I cannot even imagine a giant horse dead. So anyway, and then you have the added problem of the manure. So New York City, the largest city in the nation then and now, 120,000 horses in the city at any given time, drop 6 million pounds of manure every single day. There was actually a great worry in American towns and cities about the growing population of animals in the cities as the population of people grew. What were the cities going to look like in the 20th century if the rate of growth continued? Because they were literally talking about, are we going to be able to keep up with cleaning the manure from the streets? It was getting so bad. They were afraid that in the 20th century, at the rate things were going, that the streets would literally be buried in manure and they wouldn't be able to remove it fast enough. Fortunately, of course, technology changed all that in a matter of a few decades, and animals virtually disappeared from American cities, but it was a huge worry. And obviously a huge health problem with all that, wet on the street. And it was disgusting. And it smelled horrible, and in the summer, it was being blown all over the place in your face, and so it was awful. Women used to, you ever hear about women, how they would faint? You probably heard about maybe at some point that women would faint a lot in the 19th century. And they would carry with them smelling salts. Women fainted for a variety of reasons, because probably the most importantly is because they wore corsets and their whole insides were being squashed and they couldn't breathe properly. But then you're going around the streets, think about July in Chicago or Detroit, you know what it's like in July. So can you imagine wearing, ladies, what women over 100 years ago had to wear in the middle of summer? So not only being stuck in a corset, but then wearing all these layers of undergarments on top of your dress that you had to wear, as well as a hat and everything going outside. So, and then on top of it, you have all this manure in the streets and just horrible smells everywhere. Yeah, so women would carry smelling salts with them, so usually on a little necklace or on a bracelet or some type of perfume that was in it. Smelling salts apparently smell terrible, but that would revive you. Or sometimes they would carry little vials with perfume, just tiny little, like if you wore a charm bracelet, that would have a little sponge in it with perfume in it, so they would smell that. Or they would carry little bouquets of flowers, and they would hold them in their nose as they walked through the streets. New York City is really on top of trying to figure out how to clean up the city. So in the 1890s, they established essentially a garbage men system where they're called the White Wings, and these garbage men would wear these white uniforms to show the cleanliness of their job, essentially to show that what they're doing. And they would go through the streets sweeping from morning till night, and people were horrible about littering, and which actually is, I think, becoming a problem again. But anyway. And then plus all the manure. So they would go around, now this picture doesn't show it, but they would also have like garbage cans that would be on wheels. And so they would be sweeping up all this garbage and manure and shoveling it into these garbage cans. And they were actually hailed as heroes at that time period. The people of New York were so happy that something was being done. Once a year there would be a big parade that was held in New York City where the White Wings would walk down, I can't remember if it's Fifth Avenue or Madison Avenue, one of the big thoroughfares in Manhattan, and all the residents would come out and cheer for them. So they were the city of New York was really on top of trying to get a handle on this huge garbage problem in that city. By the time that we're studying, professional police departments have become common. They began to appear in the United States before the Civil War, 1838, Boston, 1845, New York City in 1851, both Albany, New York, and Chicago. And that's certainly a good thing because before that, without any type of professional police department, obviously cities were a much more dangerous place to be. It's not like they're not perfect, and they're very dangerous as it is in this period. Streets are very dark at night. Historically, people are very wary about being out at night before adequate street lights with electricity, because streets lit by, initially in some places, I don't know if it was ever done here, candles, but like some type of oil lamp or gas lighting, in which they would pipe gas, just like if you have a gas stove or a gas clothes dryer. They would pipe gas underneath the streets and then light these lanterns with some type of natural gas. And that basically does not provide a lot of light. Basically, lanterns that have gas, are powered by gas, are more like a beacon, from what I've read, in which people would kind of aim towards as they're walking at night to know where they're going. But it didn't provide a lot of light that you could tell, that I don't know if I brought this up in previous classes, but you literally on moonless nights, like people could be standing in doorways and grab you and rob you or drag you down an alley. So very dangerous places. But at least having a professional police force does help make cities safer. I mean, they have problems, though. There's a lot of corruption in government at time, and the police forces are not immune to that. Fire, as so many of my stories tend to end with, and then it burned down, is a huge problem in the 19th century. But establishing professional fire departments is a step in the right direction, and certainly helping keep cities and towns safer. Many communities, even today, can't afford to have professional fire departments, and they have volunteer fire departments. So, but obviously, it's good if you have a professional fire department. And they don't come about until only 8 years before the Civil War starts. The very first one in Cincinnati, Ohio. Certainly, when communities start putting in water systems to have running water and start installing fire hydrants, that is a major step forward, so that you don't have to just have these engines that are pumps. So the early fire engines are simply a steam engine that will create pressure, and then you have to find a body of water to actually pump the water from. And so that's obviously not a good thing. And unfortunately, a lot of communities don't have fire hydrants even today. That's very expensive to put in those types of systems. Cities, of course, are growing by leaps and bounds. The Michigan forests are actually supplying the lumber to build a lot of this infrastructure at that time. And obviously, you've heard me talk about immigrants and their lifestyles and where they live. And so new immigrants tended to move to be close to each other for support. And oftentimes, one or two family members would come over, get things established, find jobs, and then send for their wives and children. So it's usually the men came over first. And then as a lot of times what people would do is their extended family would come over, or some of their neighbors would come over. And so people tended to live in these what's called ethnic enclaves. And this map is essentially showing both nationalities, but also income of what people are making every week. So in the yellow, they're making the most money, over $20 a week. In the green, they're making between $15 and $20. In the pink, they're making between $10 and $15 a week. And then in the blue, they're making between $5 and $10 a week. And in black, under $5 a week.
Oh.
Yeah. And then essentially also is that they're living in these communities where one block might be primarily Italian, another block might be primarily Polish, but still with some Italians mixed in one street, some Polish people mixed in another street, or Croatian or Russian Jewish as well. So all the immigrants tended to congregate in certain areas of cities because that's where the lowest rents were. And so, you know, they're making the lowest amount of money, and therefore they're tending to live in areas of the city that's affordable. I mean, it's like now, you know,
Yeah.
you live where you can afford. So, you know, not everybody's going to move to Bloomfield Hills or Waukee or Grosse Pointe. Or what? Depends. Here's a photograph of inside of one of these tenement apartments. In the last chapter, you know, this topic came up before, and I showed you the outsides of a few of them. And I was talking about how they're usually 1 or 2 rooms. And then this is typical in New York of a 2-room apartment where there's no light, you know, on the inside. So you have a window, and then you have to have another window leading into the next room because that's the only way that you get any natural daylight. And people are living and sleeping everywhere. So you have to. This is apparently for the baby, but the baby's looking pretty big for that crib, you know. And then there's a bed there, and you can see here that there's not even a full stove, but there's like a little hot plate, and it's although it's gas, so that's actually an improvement. There's like gas, so you're not burning coal. Political corruption is pretty rampant, and certainly part of what becomes the populist movement and then later the progressive movement. They're trying to force the government to do something about corruption in government, and certainly secret ballots will help. But these political machines were really good at really controlling politicians, and as well as the police department. And this existed in industrial cities throughout the North, but it existed really in states across the country, in which you had these political machines that could rally voters to vote their way, and that vote for certain candidates. And then, of course, you know, if you're a politician, you're really beholden to whoever is running the party, and then the party or the leaders of the parties will skim off profits or skim off money from the public. The boss tweed is notorious in the state of New York. He ran what was known as the Tammany Hall. And he was able to skim off about $200 million in New York City alone, and he eventually goes to jail. I mean, what he did was so egregious that politicians couldn't ignore it. And it's actually through cartoons like this. A guy named Thomas Nast was political cartoonist, and he's doing all these cartoons bringing attention to the horrible political corruption that exists in New York City at the time. And eventually the public outcry is so great that it brings Boss Tweed to justice. But it's not something that just goes away overnight, all this corruption. Even with the secret ballots, even with, say, in federal elections, eventually having the direct election of United States senators, it takes many years. So even in the 20th century, Harry Truman is an interesting example. When he began his political career in the early part of the 20th century, you have in Kansas, you have this machine that's controlling the state of Kansas politics, and that's how Truman got elected. So Boss Tweed eventually goes to jail, though. Actually, he gets sent to a prison that he was responsible for getting built, and that he skimmed off a lot of money from its construction. But these political machines, well, obviously, they're extremely damaging to our democratic system. There were some things that they did that actually weren't terrible, because they often are operating in the north, in the industrial cities. They're trying to get the unskilled laborers to vote for their candidates. And who are the unskilled laborers? They tend to be immigrants. And so they were actually sticking up for the immigrant population, which certainly was a positive thing at a time when these people had no money, and really the only power that they had was their vote. And so here's, so you start to see the parties, at least some politicians, looking out for the immigrants. Part of the way that these political machines could curry favor is getting jobs for people. So, if you're going to vote for my candidate, I'll find you a job, or they might bribe you. They might just give you money. They might provide food. They might pay for your family member's funeral, or legal fees, or bring a bucket of coal to help you heat your tenement apartment. They might show up with a turkey during the holidays. So all kinds of ways that they could help curry favor, and then you vote for them. Obviously, it's helpful in places if there's not a secret ballot, because they can definitely see, they'll have people watching and keep tabs on when you're voting. Election day is always a big party day historically. So in cities, people don't work. The party machines will bring out barrels of beer and rum or whatever liquors, so that everything be free. And so all the men would go down to the local saloons or wherever they're gonna, get everyone together, and people would drink. And then I've read that they used to go vote in mass, and then they come back and drink some more, and then they go out and vote again, and then they come back and drink and vote. And so because there's not the safeguards about voting at the time, nowadays talking heads on cable or politicians, try to make a big deal about saying, oh, thousands of people are voting illegally. And then, there was a commission that was set up about a year and a half ago or something, and it disbanded, and they're like, no, there weren't, it was like, almost no cases that they could even prove that it was illegal voting because of the close tabs, which the system works nowadays, but there was no system in those days, so there's just all kinds of problems. So the last chapter talked about child labor. Part of the reason for wanting children to have mandatory, education up to a certain grade or age is because to eliminate child labor. So that's part of the reasoning. But part of the reasoning also is that those white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who were really not happy, on the one hand, that there's all these immigrants, they like paying their parents or paying the kids cheap wages, but they were afraid that you would have this continuous underclass of people that wouldn't necessarily consider themselves to be Americans. And so they wanted children to go to school to become Americans, to learn what it is to be an American. And so that's part of the reason for compulsory education. And you definitely see a large jump in the number of children in schools. But of course, population is growing as well. 1870, 6.9 million children in school. By 1910, 17.8 million in school. Now, there's a downside to this as well, because so many of these immigrants come from Catholic countries, and so which is another reason why the West didn't like them. And Catholics are very skeptical about these laws that are being put in place by, essentially a Protestant majority, and they're afraid that they're going to try to Protestantize their children. And so what you start to see is private schools that are opened by the Catholic Church. And so, Detroit is a great example, just like so many other cities that were growing at that time. And, I was just in Detroit with my architecture history class on Saturday, and the freeway was closed, of course, and so I was just trying to find my way back home and driving through these neighborhoods, and it's all, besides unfortunately so many streets that are just abandoned, everything's gone, but then there'll be like a huge church and a giant school next to it still. And although I drove by a few places like that, and the schools were open, generally not by the Catholic Church, but by some type of academy, which was good to see these buildings being used still. But, a lot of private schools in those days, because of the worry that the young people would be Protestantized. It's probably not a legitimate worry, but you have to realize that people were uneducated who were coming here from Europe and very skeptical about all these new ways in America. So those ideas of social Darwinism, which was in the last unit, not everybody goes along with that. This woman here, her name was Jane Addams. She was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, came from a prosperous Chicago family. She went on a trip to England, and so she's touring England, obviously doing what if you go to England today, go to, I'm sure, many of the famous historic sites, but she's also going to the industrial areas, industrial cities in England. And what she's seeing is extremely poor people living in really rundown circumstances in areas of the city, just like areas of American cities. But instead of saying Italian immigrants and Polish immigrants, what she's seeing is white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who are English citizens, and yet their life very much resembles that of the immigrants in America. And so she's questioning those ideas of social Darwinism. She's like, she was raised to believe those ideas, and yet she goes to England and she's like, these people look like me. So how can these ideas of social Darwinism be true if here we have white Anglo-Saxon Protestants living in the same conditions, working in these textile mills and these factories for very low wages? When the idea was that these are supposed to be people, everyone's supposed to be prosperous, and they're not. And so she's really questioning that. She comes home to America, uses her family's money, and buys an old, large house in Chicago, in an area that's kind of run down now, and she opens a settlement house. And settlement houses in the 19th century were in these areas of industrial cities that would help the local poor people. And often, like hers, was specifically to help women and children. So help these immigrant women, many times who didn't have husbands anymore. Their husbands may have abandoned them, and therefore helping them sometimes with daycare. Also trying to Americanize them. That was a little weird thing going on, at least initially when she opens her settlement house, is she's telling the immigrants, you got to stop making all that pasta or kielbasa, and you got to start making good old-fashioned American casseroles, and or she'd have tea parties, and these are women who are just trying to make sure that their children are safe and have a meal. And here she's having like tea parties, saying, this is the proper spoon or whatever to stir your tea. And they're like, that is something that they do not even care about, obviously, because they're just trying to get through the day. But it was a really revolutionary because, they're providing things like daycare, which is amazing because so many of these women are so far away from their families back in Europe. They don't have anybody to help them with their kids. Huge problem for families and women today, and let alone at that time. And so that's really something quite extraordinary that she's doing. And it's still existing today. So this is actually a modern photograph, I think in recent years, and the house still survives. It's much larger complex now, apparently, but anyway, it still survives. They have a website, and they're still helping people in need in the 21st century. Yeah. Cities, as I've been talking about, have all kinds of problems. And there's an idea that comes about at this time because of these problems of how do we address these problems? How do we make our cities better? How do we improve the living conditions of the populations that are living in these cities? And in the 1880s, there begins to be this idea amongst architects and designers and city officials that you need to have some type of planning. There needs to be some type of process. So not just allow for anybody to just build whatever they want, wherever they want. And nowadays, that's often an issue too. People say, I have my rights, I own this property, I can do whatever I want with it. But, like say you buy a $200,000 house. So do you want to have a $200,000 house and then somebody comes in and says, I want to save the environment, which is good, but then take a manure processing plant and build it next to your $200,000 house? No. So that's like a modern kind of example. Same thing then. Like, do you want to allow for a turpentine factory to be next to a paper mill? Well, they were doing things like that actually in Chicago. Do you know what happened in Chicago in 1871? What's that? Yeah, the Chicago fire. Like, there were so many of these industrial sites right next to each other that when the turpentine factory blew up, or the paper mill caught on fire, it caused like a firestorm, as the fire kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So they're starting to come to the conclusion that you can't just allow people to do whatever they want, because in the end, we all have to live together, and it's just too chaotic. And so they start to come up with these ideas of urban planning, and which includes having public parks, because public parks do not exist. We take public parks for granted today, and having all these state parks and metro parks in this area, city parks, Dodge Park, and it's not very far away. But they didn't exist. There are some parks in cities, but they're actually private, and they're owned by the residents who live near them, and they're fenced off, and they have a key. Everybody who owns a piece of property next to them will have a key. In New York City, there were some examples of that. So having public parks, do you know where the most people went when they wanted to go stay on a Sunday, which is the only day off for most working people in those days? Do you know what the public park where they could go to? It's not a park, but any idea? What would be a big open green space with a lot of lawn in a city? No, that's a park. No park. It's not a park. It's not going to be called a park. No? A lot of stones everywhere. Cemetery. Yeah, a cemetery. People went to the cemetery, and they would have picnics on nice warm days, because that was the only place that you could go that had green grass and had trees and flowers, because there were no public spaces where people could go to. And so anyway, public parks will obviously be something that everybody could enjoy. Creating grand boulevards, so having more space obviously for traffic, something that we still grapple with, is a huge problem. And allowing for more airflow, allowing for more light in the city, especially as the buildings get taller and taller. It becomes even more of a problem if you have narrow streets and extremely tall buildings, because then you end up with these wind tunnels, That was a problem in places like New York City, not having enough light coming down into the streets, which becomes a huge problem in the end of the 19th and early 20th century with these tall skyscrapers. So, and then the City Beautiful movement promoted neoclassical design or classical design coming from the ancients, which is kind of amongst like the new young architects at the time who are trying to develop an American style of architecture. There's people like a guy named Louis Sullivan who's really working to develop an American design form. He's very upset by that because he's like, why do we always have to look to Europe? Why can't we do something that represents us? But nevertheless, this is Western culture. America is part of Western culture. It's part of the heritage as well. At least for, of course, the European descendants of Europeans who came to live here. So anyway, that proved to be a popular form of architecture. And the World's Fair that was held in Chicago in 1893 was a great way for that actually to be shown off to millions of people. So the World's Columbian Exposition, which is also called the White City because it had these gleaming white buildings that were made of plaster. It was actually stamped. They were steel frames, but they were covered in plaster. And people could come and see the White City. Over 20 million people in the summer of 1893 went to Chicago to see this World's Fair and could see what urban planning could be. Everything was perfect. Beautiful buildings, pristinely clean streets and walkways, these beautiful waterways where electric boats took tourists through the canals, or actually they brought gondolas from Venice. You could take gondola rides through the canals. And it was really extraordinary because, of course, just outside the gates was Chicago with all of its problems. So, and if you could afford to go to the World's Fair, because it cost $2 for a ticket to get in, so it was quite expensive. You were middle class or upper middle class, so you were, a lot of mayors and city councilmen from around the country, people in positions of authority, and they often went back to their hometowns or home cities and said, why can't we do something here in our city to be more like the World's Fair? Why can't we start having some type of planning? And so the World's Fair was a big boost for this idea of the City Beautiful movement.
That still exists in Chicago?
No, unfortunately. The Museum of Science and Industry, that's the only building that survives the World's Fair. And then some of the canal, a little bit of the canal system, I think, still survives. That's near the museum. But the Midway Palaisance is part of Jackson Park. This is all built in Jackson Park. So if you've ever been to Chicago, Jackson Park, that's on the water. It was all there. That was actually a swamp at the time that had to be developed into the system of canals and then was built. So I'm going to talk more about the World's Fair, though, when I see you guys on Thursday. And part of what's changing in society is that as the middle class grows, and so, of course, the men tend to be the ones who are making the money. They're working as managers in these large corporations, national corporations, and but then the women, especially like their daughters, are getting more and more of an education. Some are even having an opportunity to go to college. Now, most people don't have an opportunity to go to college in the 19th century. It's really only in about the last 50, 60 years. After World War II, certainly, with the GI Bill, made college something that was available to everybody. But even then, even say 30, 40 years ago, the percentage of the population that actually graduated from college was somewhere fairly low, 12, maybe 15% of the population. It's much higher now. I think it's closer to about 45% now. So it's actually gone up quite significantly in the last few decades. But nevertheless, in that time, to have 20% of the college graduates be women was quite important. This is not okay with everybody. There's definitely a concern that, you know, have educated women is going to make life difficult for men. And so that's what this photograph is. It's part of it's probably part of a series that was called The New Woman, because this is part of a stereoptic card. Basically, it's a stereopticon, which you would look through, and you would put a little card in, and it would be 3D. And so they're very popular to have in your house at that time, and you would keep them in the parlor, and it's a way that people could entertain themselves at night. And so I thought this was a funny picture that I came across because it's called The New Woman Wash Day. So there she is reading a magazine that's called Truth. I'm not familiar with the magazine, but presumably it has to do with women and, you know, probably women's suffrage they're talking about, women getting the vote. And there's her husband doing the laundry. So, women certainly were becoming more politically active. Now, this is certainly by a majority of men still are not sure about this. In those days, they thought if women got the vote, it would be the end to the American family. That women needed to stay at home, to raise the children, and cook the meals. You know, life has changed a lot because if you think about earlier generations, if you were living on a farm, the husband and the wife worked together because the farm was a family business, and everyone had to pitch in and do their share. Now, if you live in a city, the husband goes off to work. He's working, you know, from morning till night. The women's place, you know, we're talking about middle class people. The woman's place is in the home, take care of the house, clean the house, cook the food, raise the children. The women were seen as being the moral core of the family. So provide the religious education and moral uplift for the family, and not go out into the dirty world of politics, which was seen as being a man's place. So there's definitely worry about that. Now, so many American families would not have been happy if their wives or daughters were going out to rallies to try to get the vote. But if they were going out to try to make the world a better place, like getting rid of drink, the temperance movement, that was okay because that was morally uplifting. If they were doing something with, say, trying to get some type of a public park or public gym built so that children would have a place to go after school, because those are ideas that are coming about at the time, that was fine because that's trying to have safe places, good places where children can go get exercise and be safe after school. That's not a problem at all. Women, of course, don't have the vote, but there are exceptions in the 19th century. Sometimes women do have the vote if it's related to, say, schools. So something to do with children again. You might be able to vote in a school board election. There are some Western states, actually, that do allow women to vote in state elections as well, because the population of women is so low in Western states at the end of the 19th century that as a way to entice women, you know, men who were going out, say, to seek their fortune when a new silver deposit was being found or a gold mine or some other type of, you know, activity where they might be accessing whatever natural resources exist in places like Colorado or Montana. But it'd be mostly men. So that you'd have all these communities full of often young men and then not many women. And so in order to entice women to go out, some states start to say women can vote. Obviously not on a national level, federal level, but state election. So that's quite interesting as well. So you do have some women voting. But if women had more of an education, they tended to get married later. Of course, which made sense because if you're going to college, then you're not going to be ready to get married, the idea is, until you finish your degree. And then if you're getting married later, women tended to have fewer children, not necessarily because they were older, but that could be a reason, but also because there's not a need to have as many children. If you are from a middle class family, that would mean that you're not living, in general, you're not living in the rural countryside. So you're not running a farm. You don't need a lot of kids to help with all the stuff that you need on farms, daily chores and things like that. Because, children are going to be then going to school. And also the people are living longer. So that's significant as well. Not because there's good medicine yet. Have horrible ideas about how to treat patients in those days. But because nutrition rates have gone up so significantly by this time, that people are just healthier because they have more food, more calories, more nutrition. And that's important. So, and therefore, you don't necessarily need to have lots of children because there will be people, your child is less likely to die. Which was, of course, still a problem. I mean, children still die in higher percentage rates in those days than they do now. But you don't need to have 10 kids, like was quite common. 7 to 10 kids have been quite common. I know my great-grandmother had, although they lived here in Detroit, just down near Jefferson, no, I think it was my great-great-grandmother, Atwater, it was. And she did have something like 8 children or something. No, I guess it was my great-grandmother. But anyway, they had like 7 or 8 children, and a few of them did die of things like whooping cough. Which, of course, childhood diseases are becoming a problem now because people aren't getting their kids vaccinated. So the new woman did things like join charities. And so, like I said, there's certain organizations that are okay for women to join, if the family is more conservative. Some of these clubs did discriminate, and so did not allow African American women to join. So, there's not a very large kind of middle class African American population yet at that time, but there is small pockets, and in that case, sometimes African American women form their own clubs. And as I said, it's okay to be involved in the temperance movement or something to do with school, because that's perfectly acceptable, morally uplifting. And the temperance movement, women and children were always the ones who tended to be affected because if their husbands drank too much, they often either beat their wives and children, or they abandoned their families altogether, and then you didn't have the main source of support, because even if everybody was working, remember, men always made more than women. So. Ida Wells is actually a great example of an African American woman who went out in society and campaigned against a huge problem in society, which was lynching. And so she went out and spoke to people about this problem that existed, especially in the South, but also in some places in the North. Abraham Lincoln's barber, who by the end of the 19th century was quite elderly, and he was actually lynched, and that would have been in Illinois.
Who?
Abraham Lincoln's barber.
And he was lynched
I don't remember exactly. I mean, there's no good reason why people are lynched, so
because
it does not matter why.
I mean, well, their reason back in that time, I mean, They had a reason for
They
everything.
didn't have,
Well, they
they
just
didn't
sort of
even have to have
they
a
think people
reason.
are uppity, as they would say, asserting their rights. Or this, sometimes people were lynched because they thought they were rude.
Or if they were witch.
No, that was 200 years earlier. So we'll come back to this on Thursday. That's a film that I'm going to show you, but it relates to the World's Fairs and the cities. Wait, I've got a few more. We're not done. I've got definitely a few more. Yep. 8 minutes. This topic has come up in the past as well. Remember when I talked about a few weeks ago, you had the farmers joining together and they formed the Grange, and they're actually able to take control of some of the state legislatures and pass reforms like restrictions on how much the railroads could charge. And so this is known as the Agrarian Revolt. And it comes out of that Grange movement of the Farmers Alliance in the 1880s. And farmers both north and south begin to join together and use their power to help better their circumstances. Now this is something quite extraordinary because in the 19th century you don't have a lot of cooperation between whites and blacks. This was something for the white, white leadership in the South. Those wealthy planters in the South were not happy about this at all because they wanted the white people to all stick together in order to keep the black people down. But most of the white people in the South had more in common with black people in the South because none of them were making any money. And it made more sense to join together, which they did for a short time. But in the end, unfortunately, race was able to champion over people's self-interest. And in the end, the wealthy whites in the South convinced the poor whites that they should not continue on with this campaign to join together politically. So I know this is very long, and you're probably going to have to go on canvas and write it down if you want. Or take your phones out and take a picture of it or something. But this is what the Farmers Alliance was trying to do. They formed this national group, National Alliance, to create a political movement. They wanted to get rid of monopolies and these trusts. They were actually, as we learned in a previous chapter, able to gain control in some states. Eventually, 12 state legislatures and 6 governors, and even on a national level, which did come up in the last time this was mentioned in one of the earlier chapters, they were even able to elect 50 congressmen to the House of Representatives and 3 senators. Now, there's technically, until 1892, there's not a separate party. It's simply Republicans and Democrats who are going along with these ideas and saying that I am out for you, the little guy, the farmer. And it's not until 1892 that officially you have the People's Party, which is the party that comes out of the Farmers Alliance. And they're only going to be around for a short time. 1893, same year as the World's Fair, the economy collapses, and the nation enters a 5-year-long period of the worst economic downturn in American history up until that point. And that certainly is an issue politically. But so the Farmers Alliance, or the People's Party, was saying we want an income tax. They're trying to appeal to, this is a big problem that they can never get over. and eventually will lead to be one of the reasons why they collapse, is that they don't have the support of the urban people. For the most part, they don't have the support of the workers, the unskilled workers, and they don't have the support of the middle classes. But they're trying to reach out, and so they have the 8-hour workday. It's something that would appeal, of course, to if you're working in a factory. Obviously, an 8-hour workday is not going to exist if you work on a farm, because you got to work and do whatever needs to be done on that day, whether it takes 8 hours or whether it takes 20 hours. Silver coinage, there's an idea at that time that if the currency is at least partially backed in silver, it will create inflation. Farmers want to have inflation because they often have to borrow money, and then if you borrow money now, but then there's inflation, you pay it back later, in a few years, then that will mean the money you pay back later on is cheaper than the money is today, and it's to your advantage. It's not to the advantage of people living in cities who have to go to the grocery store and buy food and are living on a wage. So anyway, but that's a big idea of the time, and that's actually going to come up again. So keep that in mind. They were in favor of labor organizing or unions, again trying to appeal to the workers in the factory. They wanted a direct election of U.S. senators, which of course would help political corruption because the senators would be elected by the people and not appointed by their states, which is the way that it worked until eventually in the 20th century that will change. They favored voting for women, which, this is kind of radical too, because especially when you think about it's the Farmers Alliance. These are rural people. Rural people, no matter where they live in the world, tend to be more conservative. And so to support women getting the vote is very much a radical idea at the time. Government ownership of railroads, that in those states where they took control, they were putting limits on what the railroads could charge, and actually it was being upheld in court. But this is even more radical, and actually those who believe in more radical ideas were coming up with this idea as well, is that it's more socialist ideas, which of course socialism and the ideas of Marx is definitely floating around at that time around the world. And anyway, that's seen as very radical for the government to take the railroads, to take private companies. And obviously, the very wealthy robber barons are not going to support that. Abolition of national banks. There's always been a skepticism of the big banks, and but nevertheless, the history of the nation's economy collapsing, economic history is pretty bad before you have the stable currency like the greenback, and banks issuing their own currency, which was not stable and often collapsing, people losing their life savings. So, but anyway, there is a skepticism and a distrust of the banks, of course, because rural people are often having to borrow money from banks as well. So anyway, and then government-owned storage facilities. The Grange often did build. People would pool together, have cooperatives, and build their own storage facilities. I think this might have come up before, right? So it's better to wait till the prices go up if the prices are low. And if you have a storage facility, you can do that. So it was to the advantage of the farmer. Might not be to the advantage, though, obviously, of the workers in the city. All right. And in 1892, when the People's Party is officially formed, they actually run their own candidates for the President of the United States. And because it's a national organization, joining both people from the North and the South, the candidate for the presidency is a veteran of the Union Army, and the vice president candidate is a veteran of the Confederate Army. And it's very important in politics in the years after the Civil War. If you were a veteran, that is hugely important to getting yourself elected. whether you're from the north or the south. Because you can say that I was out on the front lines, I did my part for my country, and you need to elect me because I'm a true northerner, I'm a true southerner because of this. It was called waving the bloody shirt, or waving the bloody bandana, they would call it, because it was this idea that you had served, maybe you had been wounded in the war, and now you were going to go and fight for whoever you're going to represent. The People's Party gets so many votes that it actually sways the election to a Democrat. And that was Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland actually had been a president only 4 years earlier, lost then to Benjamin Harrison, and but then becomes president again. And he's the only Democrat to serve as president of the United States in the period from the Civil War until finally when Wilson was elected in the early 20th century. So it's quite extraordinary to have a Democrat, because remember, when Reconstruction ends in 1877, part of the reasoning is not only because you have recession and political corruption, but people also, Republicans basically were saying, we can still control Congress, we can still control the White House, and we don't need the African American votes, and we don't need votes from the South. And so here was an exception to that, when the Republicans were not able to get the votes and therefore control the White House. The only time it ever happened to have a two-term president that served those terms non-consecutively. So, okay, we're going to have to end there. Anyway, we're in pretty good shape. We're going to finish this up on Thursday.
Okay, so